Hey there, it's the Board Game Bandit with my review of Sagrada. Sagrada is a dice drafting puzzle game that came out in 2017 and has quickly climbed the ranks of Board Game Geek, currently sitting at number 162 with an average rating of 7.65, despite supply issues keeping it often out of stock. It's an absolutely beautiful game where the translucent dice mimic the stained glass windows that the theme evokes. Sagrada is for 2 to 4 players with a solo variant and can be played in about 45 minutes. It's one of the games on my 10x10 challenge, and I've recorded 6 of those playthroughs so far, in addition to the plays from last year. One of my goals for this challenge was to truly explore games with which I've had little prior experience, and Sagrada definitely fit the bill. For those unfamiliar with the game, Sagrada has players filling a 4x5 grid with the dice that they draft each turn. Each of the 10 rounds has players rolling 2 dice per player plus 1. The dice come in 5 colors and are standard D6s. Players will draft dice in snake draft order, meaning that the last player goes back to back. Each die must be placed on the board so that it is diagonally or orthogonally adjacent to a previous die. Also, at no time can 2 dice of the same color touch orthogonally, and the same is true for numerical value. Each player has a unique board that contains squares with color or numerical restrictions that must also be met. There are 3 tool cards where players can spend favor tokens to gain temporary abilities to aid in placement, such as incrementing or moving dice. The more difficult the board, the more favor tokens you'll have. There are 3 public objectives that detail how points are scored. Each player also has a private objective for one of the 5 colors, which they score points for each pip of that color. Finally, players lose 1 point for each slot without a die, which can happen when the restrictions prevent you from any legal placements. I really like puzzle games and was so excited for an entry in this genre. The problem with last year's challenge was that the games began to diminish over extended plays, particularly when I had already developed my strategy before the challenge began. Sagrada was a mostly clean slate, so how has it fared? I think Sagrada is an interesting concept with a great puzzle to be solved. However, I have also come to believe that the game has a fundamental flaw that has severely hampered my enjoyment of it. Many of my friends arrived at the same conclusion independently: the private objectives are just too powerful. I will actually go one step further. The private objectives break the spirit of the game entirely. One of the benefits of logging plays is that I get to record the score as well and get a sense of how well I do in a game. I'm always going to be a target in games, and that's certainly been true in Sagrada, but that only really comes into play in the last 2 or 3 rounds, when players are specifically hate drafting. There are games where I lose when players deliberately target me and knock my score down, but I don't think Sagrada is one of them. Yet when I look at the scores I've recorded, a pattern emerges. I won once, and in every other game I've gotten either 3rd or 4th place. Granted, I'm allowed to be bad at a game, but I don't think I'm bad at Sagrada. I fill my board almost every time, maybe missing 1 spot at most, and I tend to score the maximum possible for each public objective. Yet I still lose decisively. In every game I've played, and in several games I've witnessed where I wasn't playing, the winner had the highest private objective score by far, even me in the 1 game that I've won. Why is this a problem? Maybe the key to the game is to focus on the private objective. My point is that Sagrada, as a game, should not have this focus. Granted, no game should have a key single path to victory, which makes the game solvable, but sometimes it's inevitable. But incentivizing the private objective above all else ruins Sagrada because it detracts from the game's identity, which is a puzzle. How can I arrange the dice in a way where they all fit and match the pattern specified by the game? There are 10 different public objectives, and you choose 3 of them, greatly increasing the variability of the game, and it turns out none of it matters. Take a careful look at some of the public objective cards to assess their value. For example, consider a light shadow which rewards 2 points for each set of 1 and 2 on your board. A set of 2 dice, a 1 and a 2, is worth 2 total points, or 1 point each. Drafting a randomly rolled 6 is worth 3 times that amount. Even if that dice forces you to leave one spot open, it's still worth 5 points for 2 turns of actions, still worth more than the light shadow. However, each die can contribute to potentially 3 public objectives, but most of the public objectives average 1 point per die, so if you score all 3 of them, that's still only 3 points per die. Some, like the rose shade variety, score 6 points for 5 dice, just over a point per die, but a single 6 of your private color matches that score. As a result, random chance of what colors happen to have higher rolls will mathematically drive the game. A game that should be about a puzzle is instead about a compulsion to focus on a single color. As I've stated before, several of my friends and I reached this conclusion independently, and we aren't alone. I've read several forums online to see what others thought, and many reached the same conclusion. Private objectives are too powerful. Some suggested having the pips, but it still doesn't solve the problem that the randomness of the roll is ultimately what matters. Playing Sagrada has become very jarring, where I seem to be doing really well on the board, only to lose emphatically because my color wasn't rolled highly enough. I played games with a full board where my total score was less than someone's private score alone in a different game, and that is definitely problematic. It really shows how weak the public objectives are, and I cannot bring myself to have tunnel vision on the private objective when I am in a position to draft a high private value die, because it's against the spirit of the game in my opinion. The last time I played, an interesting phenomenon happened where the player to my right drafted almost all of the dice of my private color. This was necessary to that player because they were focusing entirely on their private objective color, and it was easier to zero in on 2 colors to maximize flexibility later. It was a very intriguing strategy. Unfortunately, as the player to my right, this person drafted before me 3 out of 4 turns, making it virtually impossible for me to get the yellow that I needed. What was my total private objective score? 9. The private objective score of the winner? Somewhere in the 30s. Actually, the player to my right should have won, but didn't because of the actions of the final player, but I'm sure that will come up in the airing of grievances this year. When you extend this problem to games with less than 4 players, you will not use every die in the bag. If one color comes out disproportionately, the player with that private objective is at a severe disadvantage. Many players have house ruled that with less players, you take out an equal number of dice per color, just like they house rule the private objective. But I hesitate very strongly to use house rules, and there are only 2 games where I actually do, and one of them isn't really a rule so much as a first turn suggestion to always make a secret bet in Colossal Arena. I do not like house rules for 2 reasons. First, house rules create confusion because players do not realize they are being taught incorrectly, which leads to arguments as gaming communities spread. Second, I feel it is somewhat insulting to the designer to assume that I know their game better than they do. Designers spend hours upon hours playtesting their game, and the idea of me fixing a game after a few playthroughs seems wrong to me. I once played a game of Love Letter, a simple deduction game, where a player insisted on discarding all cards face down, turning a deduction game into a memory game, and it's completely against the spirit of Love Letter. So I hate house rules, and most of the time, even when it pains me, I will follow the designer's instructions as gospel unless I'm really motivated otherwise. And I think that Sagrada may end up being the third example of this. I just don't know what the ruling should be. I am leaning towards just accruing 1 point for each die of that color, since it alleviates the fact that if blue rolls all high numbers, blue is at an extreme advantage. But I also played a game where the board I took screwed me over. I always take the highest difficulty board I'm dealt to emphasize the puzzle aspect, but I got some really easy and uninspired choices. As a result, the side I chose had so many color restrictions that most spots had only one logical color that could go there before the game even began. So even if the dice had been rolled high all game long, I'd have nowhere to put them, and the tool cards had no movement or ability to ignore color restrictions. It felt like I had lost before the game even began, and effectively I did. I wonder if the private objective should be abandoned altogether and reward players for precision and execution. I was thinking about a comparable game called Dimension, which I highly recommend if you haven't played. You can check out my review of the game on theboardgamebandit.com under my list of gateway games. In Dimension, you have 5 colors of 3 spheres each that you stack on a 3-dimensional board. Each round has a unique puzzle of 6 restrictions that must be met at all times, similar to Sagrada, such as colors not touching, colors that must touch, and altitude restrictions, etc. Since the game is about not breaking the rules, the game incentivizes you to not break the rules. Yes, you can score more points by placing more spheres, but if you break a rule in doing so, it may have been better to never place that sphere at all. Which is how it should be, emphasizing the identity of the game while allowing the quantity to be a stretch goal. But the private objective in Sagrada isn't a stretch goal, it's the only goal that matters, and that greatly ruins my enjoyment of the game because I am unable to adapt. I want to be wrong about this, but empirically it's been the case every time. Yes, you can argue that it's easy to decipher what color a player has, but it's possible that the damage can be done early in the game and you'll never recover. I'm aware that there is a 5 to 6 player expansion coming out soon, and I've tried to stay away from it lest it influence my opinion of the base game. However, some friends have discussed it with me briefly, and it seems like they are changing how the private objectives work, which seems to be an acknowledgement that they are broken. Then again, there are only 5 colors of dice in Sagrada, and with a 6th player, that means you need either a 6th color or a new paradigm entirely, so who knows. It's a real shame that I have to put my final judgment on hold until I get a sense of potential revamped rules. This is because I may not want to play a game that I currently feel is broken, but I don't necessarily want to invest more money trying to fix it. And this is a real shame because the concept fascinates me. Admittedly, I didn't like the game at first because in my first game, a distracted father holding his baby in one arm kept inadvertently hate drafting the dice I needed, which he was unable to place. It turns out he had trouble understanding the core concept of the game and wasn't even looking at my board. He just kept making mistakes. But I believed in the idea so much, and it held such promise. But as of now, Sagrada is projected to be my least favorite game on my 10x10 challenge. I'm currently more excited about Sellswords, which I initially rated a 6, which is really low for me. I don't understand how this game is rated so highly, considering what to me is an obvious design flaw. It can't just be because the game is pretty, because in my experience, pretty gets old and newer gets prettier. The exercise of filling your board is so rewarding. I love the tension of hoping that a specific die comes back to me, hoping my opponents do not realize there's only one I can place. I love watching other players slowly realize that they blocked parts of their board and that they will have gaps in their masterpiece. I love all these aspects of the game. I just wish they meant something in the final scoring. Or maybe I'm secretly terrible at Sagrada without realizing it. I'm open to the possibility, but given that I tend to achieve the perfect board for public objectives, it's hard for me to believe that this is the case, which is disappointing. I can enjoy a game even if I'm bad at it, but with Sagrada, I feel like the results are ultimately out of my hands, and this isn't supposed to be a push your luck game where I accept that type of outcome. It's a puzzle, and Sagrada reminds me of playing a game of solitaire where, based on the initial shuffle, you cannot possibly win no matter what you do. Why bother playing? This is not what I want in a puzzle game, and I much rather prefer Dimension or Karuba at this point. I should also state that I believe that there is a strong turn order advantage where it is advantageous to be the snake on the last round. It insulates you from hate drafting because when you go first that round, it makes it really hard to hope that there is a valid option that comes back around to you. Alternatively, if the tool card exists where you can draft twice in a row, This is incredibly powerful in the last round, and going first that round becomes an extreme advantage. In some games, I felt like I was at the mercy of other players even when I wasn't winning. If you've played Sagrada and have had similar experiences, let me know in the comments. Or if you're seeing something I'm not, please let me know, as I would love to be wrong about this game. I'm the Board Game Bandit, and our game has just begun.